It hits you late at night, usually the moment your head touches the pillow. The house is quiet, the television is off, the distractions are gone, and suddenly, the questions arrive. Why did I allow that? Why didn't I stand up for myself? Why do I keep repeating the same mistakes? Why can't I get anywhere in life? Why did they treat me that way? Why do people seem to walk all over me? Why do I keep attracting the same kind of relationships? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, why am I like this? Most people spend their entire lives running from that question, because deep down, they sense something they can't explain. A hidden force, a stranger living inside them, influencing their decisions, sabotaging their relationships, destroying opportunities, and controlling their life from behind the curtain. Carl Jung believed that hidden force had a name, the shadow, and until you confront it, it will run your life, without you ever knowing. But here's the disturbing part. The shadow is not what most people think it is, and by the end of this video, you may never see yourself the same way again, because the person you believe you are may only be half of who you actually are. When you were a child, something happened. Not one event, thousands of them. Every time you were told, don't be angry, don't be selfish, be nice, don't cause trouble. Good boys don't do that. Good girls don't act like that. You learned a dangerous lesson. Certain parts of you were acceptable, others were not. So you began building a mask, a socially acceptable version of yourself, a version that earned love, approval, acceptance, and little by little, the parts that didn't fit that image were pushed into the darkness. Your aggression, your ambition, your envy, your selfishness, your desire for power, your capacity to say no. Everything society didn't reward was buried. And somewhere in this video, you're going to meet a man who spent most of his life doing everything he thought he was supposed to do. He worked hard, he sacrificed, he became respectable, successful, reliable, the kind of man others admired, the kind of man people pointed to and said, he's done well for himself. But there was one thing he didn't realize until it was almost too late. We'll come back to him later, because his story may explain more about your life than you expect. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Most people hear that quote. Few understand it. Because they assume darkness means evil, it doesn't. Sometimes your darkness contains the very strength you've been searching for, and that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. What I'm about to tell you may completely change how you see every difficult person in your life. Think about someone who irritates you, really irritates you. Maybe they're arrogant, maybe they're selfish, maybe they're attention-seeking, maybe they seem completely full of themselves. Now here's Jung's unsettling observation. The traits that trigger the strongest emotional reactions in us often reveal hidden parts of ourselves. Not always, but often. Why? Because the shadow doesn't like being discovered. It hides. It disguises itself. And one of its favorite disguises is judgment. You condemn in others what you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. The arrogance you hate may be your own buried confidence. The selfishness you despise may be your neglected self-respect. The aggression you fear may be your unexpressed strength. And suddenly, the people who annoy you most become mirrors, not enemies. Mirrors. But that's only the beginning, because the shadow has another weapon: projection. Have you ever noticed how some people seem cursed? Different jobs, same problems, different partners, same heartbreak, different cities, same frustrations. The scenery changes, the story doesn't. Why? Because wherever you go, your shadow goes with you. Jung observed something fascinating. Until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Most people will hear this and immediately reject it. That's exactly why it matters. Most people think fate is happening to them. What if it's happening through them? What if the reason life keeps repeating certain lessons isn't bad luck? What if it's because something buried inside you keeps recreating the same circumstances, the people, the conflicts, the disappointments, over and over again, not as punishment, but as an invitation to see what you've spent decades avoiding. And this becomes especially important after 40. Because by this stage of life, the consequences have accumulated, the patterns have become visible, the excuses have started running out, and the shadow becomes harder to ignore. Now here's where most self-help advice gets it wrong. It tells you to eliminate your darkness, to stay positive, to think happy thoughts, to become your best self. But Jung warned against this, because trying to become purely good creates a dangerous illusion. The more saintly you try to appear, the more powerful the hidden shadow becomes. Imagine trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The harder you push, the more violently it eventually erupts. That's what happens psychologically. Suppressed anger becomes resentment. Suppressed ambition becomes depression. Suppressed strength becomes helplessness. Suppressed truth becomes anxiety. The shadow doesn't disappear, it waits, and eventually it demands attention. And this is where most people turn back, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a theory. It's something that happens quietly, so quietly that many people don't realize it's happening until decades have passed. Let me tell you about a man I'll call David. At 55 years old, David had everything he once believed would make him happy. A successful business, a beautiful home, the respect of his peers, children who had grown into capable adults. From the outside, he looked like a man who had won, the kind of man others envied, the kind of man people pointed to and said, "He's made it." But every night after everyone else had gone to bed, David would sit alone in his kitchen, sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes in complete silence, and a question would emerge that he could never quite answer. Why don't I feel the way I thought I would? The strangest part wasn't that he was unhappy. The strangest part was that he couldn't explain why. He had done everything right. Everything he was told to do: work hard, be responsible, provide, sacrifice, endure. And yet something felt missing, something important, something he couldn't name. Little things began to irritate him. People annoyed him more than they used to. He became impatient, more cynical, less hopeful. He found himself looking at younger people with a mixture of envy and regret, and the more he tried to push those feelings away, the stronger they became. Then one day, during an ordinary conversation, someone asked him a question. What did you want before everyone told you who you should be? David opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Not because he didn't know, because he had forgotten. For 30 years, he had been playing a role: the provider, the responsible one, the dependable one, the man who never complained, the man who never caused trouble, the man who always did what was expected. And somewhere along the way, the role became his identity, or at least he thought it did, because beneath that identity, something else was waiting: his creativity, his anger, his ambition, his curiosity, his desire for adventure, his hunger for more, his ability to say no. The very parts of himself he had sacrificed in exchange for acceptance. His shadow had spent decades waiting, and now it was collecting the debt. Because the shadow is patient, far more patient than you are. It can wait 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, even 50 years. But eventually it wants to be acknowledged, and if you refuse to listen, it begins speaking through suffering, through resentment, through anxiety, through depression, through emptiness, through the unbearable feeling that your life somehow belongs to someone else, even when everything appears successful. And here's the uncomfortable question. How much of David's story sounds familiar? Because this may not be David's story at all. It may be yours. But wait, it gets darker. Because here's what Jung discovered that terrified even him. The shadow doesn't only contain the parts of yourself you consider bad. It also contains some of the best parts of who you could have become. Think about that for a moment. Most people assume their shadow is made of anger, greed, jealousy, selfishness, and sometimes it is. But what if your shadow also contains your courage, your confidence, your creativity, your leadership, your ability to demand respect? What if the life you've been searching for requires qualities you've spent decades suppressing? This is where most people become uncomfortable, because it means the prison door may have been unlocked the entire time, and they were the ones holding it shut, not consciously, but psychologically. The very traits they needed to move forward were hidden in the same darkness they spent their lives avoiding. And that's why transformation feels so strange. You aren't becoming someone new. You're recovering someone old, someone you buried years ago. The child who once spoke freely, the teenager who still had dreams, the younger version of yourself who hadn't yet learned to trade authenticity for approval. And when people finally begin integrating their shadow, they often say something remarkable, not, "I've become a different person," but, "I finally feel like myself again." So how do you face your shadow? You begin with radical honesty. Ask yourself, what traits trigger me most in other people? What emotions do I refuse to express? What truths am I afraid to admit? Where in my life am I playing small? What part of me have I abandoned to gain acceptance? The next 60 seconds may explain a pattern you've been living with for decades. Listen carefully, because answers will emerge, not all at once, but piece by piece, like fragments of a forgotten map. You may discover your kindness is actually fear of conflict. Your humility is fear of rejection. Your patience is suppressed resentment. Your selflessness is exhaustion disguised as virtue. These discoveries hurt, but they also liberate. Because awareness transforms, what is unconscious controls you. What becomes conscious can be directed. Remember the questions from the beginning? Why did I allow that? Why didn't I stand up for myself? Why do I keep repeating the same mistakes? Now you know why. Because somewhere along the way, being accepted became more important than being authentic. And every time that happened, a piece of you was left behind. The part that could have spoken, the part that could have said no, the part that could have demanded respect, the part that could have protected you. Not destroyed, not lost, just hidden, waiting, patiently, in the shadow. And every time life demanded those qualities, you felt their absence. That absence became frustration. That frustration became confusion. And that confusion became the question that keeps people awake long after the world has gone quiet. Why am I like this? But perhaps that's the wrong question. Maybe the real question is, who would I be if I stopped running from myself? Who would I be if I stopped apologizing for parts of myself that were never wrong to begin with? Who would I be if I finally welcomed back the parts of me I left behind? The tragedy is not that you have a shadow. Everyone does. The tragedy is reaching the end of your life without ever meeting it. Because the qualities you need most are often hiding in the very places you've been taught to fear. And perhaps that's why you're here. Not to become someone new, not to reinvent yourself, not to create a different identity, but to recover the person you abandoned long ago. The person who has been waiting for you all this time, quietly, patiently, in the dark, waiting for you to finally come home. If this resonated with you, tell me in the comments, what part of yourself have you been hiding for the longest time? And if you're brave enough, what do you think your shadow is trying to teach you right now?